Hi, my name is Nova. I'm 36, a product manager, and most importantly, a mother. The cruelest insult I've ever heard wasn't from a stranger on the street or a rival at work. It was from my own father, at my own dinner table, in the house I had bought with my own two hands. He looked right at me, his face a mask of disappointment, and uttered one word that shattered the fragile peace I had spent my life building: freeloaders. He didn't say it to my brother, the one who had drained our family's resources for years. He didn't say it about some distant, struggling relative. He said it about me, his daughter, and about my 12-year-old son, Dylan, who was sitting right next to me. Inside the home I worked my whole life to buy. That one word tore through the room like lightning, silent and devastating, and in that instant I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. The memory of that lawyer's office is as clear to me now as if it were yesterday. I was 18, perched nervously on the edge of a deep burgundy leather chair that sighed every time I shifted my weight. The air in Mr. Abernathy's office smelled of lemon polish, old paper, and a faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco that seemed to have soaked into the dark wood paneling on the walls. Sunlight streamed through the tall, mullioned windows, catching dust motes in its golden shafts and illuminating the spines of the thick, intimidating law books that lined every wall from floor to ceiling. It was a room that commanded silence and respect, and I felt impossibly small within it. Mr. Abernathy, my grandfather's longtime friend and solicitor, was a kind, weary-looking man with silver hair and gentle eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses. He had always treated me with a warmth that was noticeably absent in my own home. He began by speaking about my grandfather, sharing a story about a fishing trip they'd taken when they were boys. His voice was soft, and his words painted a picture of the man I knew, quiet, observant, and deeply thoughtful. He told me Grandpa had been proud of my grades, that he'd seen a determination in me. It was the most praise I had received in my entire life, and I had to fight to keep my composure. Then, he pushed a thick, cream-colored envelope across the vast, polished expanse of his mahogany desk. My name, Nova Sterling, was typed in crisp black letters on the front. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. Inside, nestled among pages of dense formal language, was the clause that would change everything. My grandfather, Arthur Sterling, had bequeathed to me the sum of $100,000. The words seemed to lift off the page. He specified that it was for my education and to help establish my future. It was a gift, pure and simple, with only one intention: to give me a chance, $100,000. The number was abstract, astronomical. It was more money than I could possibly comprehend. I read the sentence again and again, the words blurring through the tears that welled in my eyes. It wasn't just the money. It was the validation. It was the proof that someone in my family had seen me, not as an accessory to my brother, not as a background character in the family drama, but as me, a person with potential, with dreams, with a future worth investing in. I walked out of that office into a world that looked entirely different. The summer sky seemed bluer, the air fresher. I walked for hours, the envelope clutched in my hand like a holy relic. I went to a small cafe, ordered a coffee I barely touched, and just sat, staring into space. The future, which had always felt like a long, dark tunnel, suddenly opened up into a vast, sunlit field of possibilities. I could finally use the acceptance letter from the university in another state, the one I had hidden at the bottom of my desk drawer. It was a good school, with a renowned computer science program. I had worked so hard for it, studying late into the night, driven by the desperate need to escape. Now I could actually go. I imagined my dorm room, small and sparse, but entirely mine. I could put up posters of bands my parents hated. I could study until 3 a.m. without being told I was wasting electricity. I saw myself in a lecture hall, surrounded by people who were as passionate about learning as I was. I dreamed of a life where I could build things, solve problems, and stand on my own 2 feet, beholden to no one. That money wasn't just tuition and rent. It was the foundation for a new life, a life of my own design. It was the ultimate gift of freedom. That evening, bursting with a naive excitement, I decided to tell my parents. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that this tangible proof of my grandfather's faith in me might finally make them see me differently. I imagined they would be proud, that they might even congratulate me. I found them in the living room, the television casting a flickering blue light across their faces. The room was a museum of their priorities. The mantelpiece was crowded with Phillips trophies, baseball, soccer, even a small cheap one for participation in a local science fair. There wasn't a single picture of me in the room that didn't also have my brother in it, usually front and center. I cleared my throat, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. I have some news, I began, my voice unsteady. I told them about Mr. Abernathy, about the will, about the money. For a moment, there was silence. My mother's face was unreadable. My father simply stared at me, his expression hardening. The hope I'd felt began to curdle in my stomach. This was not the reaction I had dreamed of. $100,000, my father said slowly, the words heavy and flat. He looked not at me but at my mother. A silent, significant glance passed between them, a conversation I was not privy to but whose conclusion I could already feel. That's wonderful, dear, my mother said, but her smile was brittle, a thin curve that didn't touch her eyes. Your grandfather was always so generous. The trap was set. The next evening, they called me into that same living room for what they termed a family meeting. I knew instantly that this was an ambush. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken intentions. My dad stood in his usual spot by the fireplace, his arms crossed, a posture of immovable authority. My mother sat on the sofa, her hands clasped, her face a mask of practiced sincerity. Nova, honey, she began in a soft, persuasive tone. Your father and I were talking. We are so proud of you for wanting to go to college, we truly are. But we need to think about the family as a whole. The family as a whole. It was their favorite phrase, and it always meant the same thing. Philip, my father took over, his voice devoid of any warmth. Your brother has an opportunity, a real one. He wants to start a construction company. He's got the skills, the drive. All he needs is the capital to get started. I felt a cold wave of understanding wash over me. I shook my head, clutching the idea of my future like a shield. No, the money is for my education. Grandpa was very specific. He wanted me to go to college. It's a sure thing, Nova, my mother insisted, leaning forward. He has a business plan and everything. It's a solid investment. In a few years, he'll have more than enough money to pay you back, and you can go to any college you want. This is a chance to lift the entire family up. You wouldn't want to be selfish, would you? Selfish. The word was a button they had installed in me at birth, and they knew exactly how to press it. To want something for myself was selfish. To have my own dreams was selfish. To stand in the way of Philip, the golden boy, was the ultimate act of selfishness. I tried to argue, but this is my one chance, I pleaded, my voice cracking. The acceptance is for this year. I can't defer it indefinitely. This is what Grandpa wanted for me. My father's expression turned to one of profound disappointment, a look that had always been more effective than any anger. Your grandfather was an old man. He didn't understand the modern world. A college degree is just a piece of paper. A business, a real, tangible business, is a legacy. Philip is trying to build a legacy for this family. Are you going to stand in his way? The conversation went on for what felt like hours. They twisted my words, belittled my dreams, and framed my refusal as a betrayal of the entire family. They painted a picture of a bleak future where, because of my selfishness, my brother's potential was squandered and the family continued to struggle. And they painted another picture, a rosy one where my loan was the seed that grew into a mighty tree of prosperity, with me eventually reaping the rewards. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. By the end of it, I was exhausted, emotionally battered and utterly defeated. The vision of my future, once so bright and clear, was now murky and distant. They had successfully planted the seeds of guilt and doubt. Was I being selfish? Was it my duty to help? The weight of their expectations was a physical force, pressing down on me until I could no longer stand up for myself. The next morning, my father drove me to the bank. The silence in the car was heavy and suffocating. He didn't look at me once. At the bank, he did all the talking. I was just a ghost, a hand to sign the papers. The teller, a woman who knew my family from church, smiled brightly. Oh, that is just so wonderful, Nova. Supporting your brother's dream. Your parents must be so proud. I felt a wave of nausea. I signed where I was told to sign, my signature a shaky, unfamiliar scrawl. I watched the teller stamp the papers and slide them into a folder, and just like that, it was done. $100,000, my entire future, was gone. As we walked out of the bank, my father put a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of ownership. You did the right thing, he said, his voice flat and final. The business, of course, was a disaster. Philip was arrogant and inexperienced. He bought a brand new, top-of-the-line truck he couldn't afford and hired his friends, who spent more time drinking on the job site than working. He underbid on contracts and then tried to cut corners, ruining his reputation before it even started. The $100,000 evaporated in less than a year. There was no talk of paying me back. There was no apology. My sacrifice was never spoken of again. It was simply erased from the family history, a secret buried under a mountain of my brother's failures and my parents' denial. But I never forgot. I had learned the most important lesson of my life. To my family, I was not a daughter. I was a resource. And I knew then that if I was ever going to have a life, I would have to build it somewhere far, far away from them. The year after my inheritance vanished was the longest of my life. I remained in my parents' house, a prisoner in a cell of unspoken resentment. The air was thick with the failure of Philip's business, a failure that was never acknowledged, but was always present. He was sullen and short-tempered, while my parents treated him with a delicate sympathy, as if he were the victim. I, on the other hand, was treated with a cool indifference. I was the ghost at the dinner table, a constant silent reminder of the sacrifice they had all agreed to forget. The final straw came on a Tuesday in late August. It was hot and humid, and the atmosphere in the house was more oppressive than usual. My mother asked me to hem a pair of Philip's new jeans. "He has a job interview tomorrow," she said, not looking at me. "He needs to look sharp." The casual injustice of it. My brother, who had squandered my entire future, was now in need of my help for his next fresh start, was too much to bear. I looked at the jeans in her hand, then at her face, and I felt something inside me finally snap. That night, I packed. It didn't take long. My duffel bag was half empty. I took a few changes of clothes, some well-worn paperbacks, and the few sentimental items I owned, a small, faded photograph of my grandfather and me at a county fair, and my university acceptance letter. The letter was crumpled and soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. It represented a life I would never have, but it was also the only proof I had that I was capable of more than this. I left a short, simple note on the kitchen counter. "I'm gone." No explanation, no forwarding address. They didn't deserve one. With less than $200 in my pocket, I bought a one-way bus ticket to a city 3 hours away. It wasn't far, but it felt like another planet. The bus ride was a blur of dark highways and the lonely lights of passing towns. With every mile that passed, I felt a strange mix of terror and liberation. I was running away from everything I had ever known, but I was also running towards a future that would be entirely my own, for better or worse. The city was overwhelming at first. The noise, the crowds, the sheer indifference of it all was a shock. My first week was a desperate scramble. I stayed at a grimy youth hostel, sleeping in a room with 7 other people, my duffel bag clutched to my chest. During the day, I walked until my feet were raw, looking for 2 things, a job and a place to live. I found the apartment first. It wasn't much. It was a tiny studio on the 3rd floor of a dilapidated brick building, with a window that looked out onto a graffiti-covered alley. The room smelled of old paint and mildew. The linoleum on the floor was cracked and peeling, and the only appliances were a rusty hot plate and a mini fridge that rattled ominously. But it was mine. The landlord, a suspicious man with a permanent scowl, took most of my remaining cash for the first month's rent and a security deposit. Now I was truly on my own, with less than $50 to my name. The fear of failure was a constant, gnawing presence. I applied for every job I could find. I was turned down from most of them. Finally, I found 2. The first was a waitressing job at a 24-hour diner called The Corner Spot. The second was a night stalker position at a cavernous all-night grocery store. My life quickly fell into a brutal, exhausting routine. From 4 p.m. until midnight, I was at the diner. I learned to balance heavy trays, to memorize complex orders, and to smile at customers who treated me like I was invisible. The work was grueling, the customers often rude, and the pay was barely enough to cover my bus fare. But there were small moments of grace. A fellow waitress named Maria, a single mother who worked 3 jobs, would sometimes slip me a hot meal when the manager wasn't looking. "You gotta eat, skinny," she'd say with a tired smile. Her kindness was a lifeline in a sea of indifference. After my shift, I'd take the bus across town to the grocery store, Food World. From 1 a.m. to 7 a.m., I worked in the vast, silent aisles, my only company the hum of the freezers and the occasional late-night shopper. The work was physically demanding, lifting heavy boxes, climbing ladders, stocking endless shelves. It was lonely, mindless work that gave me too much time to think. In the sterile, fluorescent glare of the grocery store, my loneliness felt immense. I'd see couples arguing over ice cream flavors, or parents trying to soothe crying toddlers, and the ache for some kind of human connection would be almost unbearable. I would get back to my tiny apartment just as the sun was rising, my body aching and my mind numb with fatigue. I would sleep for a few hours before I had to get up and go to my classes at the local community college. I had enrolled the first week I arrived, paying for my first semester's tuition in installments. It was the only part of my day that felt like it was for me. My classes in programming and mathematics were an oasis of logic and order in a life that felt chaotic and precarious. I studied with a desperate intensity, fueled by cheap coffee and the cold fire of my anger. The acceptance letter was taped to the wall above my makeshift desk, a constant reminder of what I was fighting for. There were times when I thought I wouldn't make it. I remember one particularly bleak winter I got sick with the flu. I had a raging fever and couldn't afford to take time off work. I remember stocking shelves, my head pounding and my body shivering, tears of self-pity freezing on my cheeks in the cold of the dairy aisle. I had never felt so utterly alone. There was no one to call, no one to bring me soup, no one to care if I lived or died. It was in those moments, at the very bottom, that I discovered a strength I never knew I had. I learned to be my own caretaker, my own source of comfort. I learned that survival was a choice you had to make every single day. My parents and my brother never once tried to contact me. Their silence was its own kind of message. It told me that my absence was a relief to them. I had served my purpose and now I was gone. The pain of that realization was sharp, but it was also liberating. It severed the last fraying thread of obligation that had tied me to them. I was truly on my own, and while it was terrifying, it was also the beginning of my real life. I was no longer a resource to be exploited. I was a person, being built from the ground up, in silence and in struggle. The 2 years I spent at community college were a blur of exhaustion and relentless focus. My life was a carefully balanced equation of work, study, and a few precious hours of sleep. I made no friends, had no social life. My entire existence was geared towards a single goal, getting into a 4-year university and finishing the degree I had started. The work was grueling, but every A I earned on an exam felt like a victory. A small piece of the future I was reclaiming for myself. The day I received my acceptance letter from the state university, along with a modest scholarship for transfer students, I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment and cried. They were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. All the lonely nights, the aching muscles, the constant gnawing anxiety, it had all been worth it. I had done it, on my own. University life was a different world. I was surrounded by people my age, but I felt like a visitor from another planet. They talked about parties, spring break trips, and allowances from their parents. I was juggling 2 part-time jobs, living off campus in a slightly better but still shabby apartment, and counting every single penny. The feeling of being an outsider was profound, but I didn't let it deter me. I was there for one reason, to get my education. I threw myself into my computer science courses with a fierce dedication. The logic of coding, the challenge of solving complex problems. It was a world where the rules made sense, where effort was rewarded, a stark contrast to the arbitrary and unjust world of my family. The day of my graduation is a memory etched in shades of gray and pride. The sky was overcast, and a cool breeze rustled the black gowns of the thousands of students gathered on the university's main lawn. I sat alone, a solitary figure in a sea of celebrating families. I watched as parents hugged their children, their faces beaming with pride. I saw siblings playfully jostling each other, taking goofy pictures. For a fleeting moment, a familiar ache of loneliness settled in my chest. I had sent my parents an invitation, a single formal card mailed without a return address. It was a foolish, hopeful gesture, and their predictable silence was the final confirmation I needed that the door to my past was well and truly closed. When my name was called, Nova Sterling, summa cum laude, the announcer's voice boomed across the lawn. The distinction was a surprise even to me. I had been so focused on just getting through that I hadn't realized how well I had actually done. As I walked across the stage, my worn-out shoes clicking on the wooden platform, I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated pride. I shook the dean's hand, accepted the diploma holder, and for a brief moment, I looked out at the faceless crowd. There was no one there for me, no one to witness my triumph. But as I walked back to my seat, I realized I didn't need them. I was my own witness. The only applause that mattered was the one happening inside my own heart. After the ceremony, while other graduates went off to celebratory dinners with their families, I went back to my apartment. I ordered a pizza, my one celebratory extravagance, and sat on my couch, the diploma lying on the coffee table in front of me. It was more than just paper and ink. It was a testament to my resilience. It was the key to a future they had tried to steal from me. Landing my first real job was another battle. I sent out dozens of resumes and went on countless interviews. I competed against graduates from more prestigious universities, candidates who had the polish and confidence that comes from a life without struggle. But my hunger and my work ethic set me apart. I finally got an offer from a mid-sized tech company for a position as a junior software developer. The starting salary was more money than I had ever seen in my life. The corporate world was another steep learning curve. I was quiet and reserved, a stark contrast to the assertive, outgoing personalities around me. But I was a quick study and a relentless worker. I poured all the energy I had once devoted to survival into my career. I was the first one in the office and the last one to leave. I took on the difficult projects that no one else wanted. I learned to speak up in meetings, to defend my ideas, and to command respect through sheer competence. The promotions came slowly but steadily. Junior developer to senior developer to team lead. With each step up the ladder, I felt a layer of my old fear and insecurity fall away. I was no longer the broke, terrified girl stocking shelves at 3 a.m. I was a professional, a leader, a woman who had earned her place at the table. By the time I was 32, I had done something that had once seemed like an impossible dream. I bought a house. It wasn't a mansion, but it was perfect. A charming 2-story home with a small garden in the back and a big bay window in the living room, on a quiet, tree-lined street. The day of the closing, after all the papers were signed, the realtor handed me the keys. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors. The house was filled with the smell of fresh paint and possibility. I stood in the living room, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window, and I felt a profound sense of peace. This was my sanctuary, a place of safety and stability that I had built for myself with my own 2 hands. A year later, my son Dylan was born. Holding him for the first time was a transformative experience. As I looked at his tiny, trusting face, I felt a love so fierce and protective it took my breath away. It was a love without conditions, without expectations. It was everything I had never received from my own parents. In that moment, I knew that my life's purpose had shifted. It was no longer just about building a life for myself. It was about creating a safe, loving world for my son. For the next few years, that's exactly what we did. Our life was simple, predictable, and happy. It was a world of bedtime stories, finger painting, and Saturday morning pancakes. It was a world of scraped knees, science fair projects, and unconditional love. I had built a life from scratch, a life of peace and stability. I had finally truly escaped my past. Or so I thought. The Tuesday the call came was aggressively, beautifully ordinary. I was standing in my sun-drenched kitchen, the scent of garlic and basil hanging in the air as I prepped ingredients for pasta sauce. Dylan, now 12, and in that lanky, awkward phase between boy and teenager, was at the kitchen table, meticulously shading in a map for his geography homework. The low hum of the refrigerator, the gentle scratching of his colored pencils on paper, the rhythmic chop of my knife against the wooden cutting board. It was the peaceful, domestic symphony of the life I had so painstakingly constructed. It was a life I guarded fiercely. When my phone buzzed on the countertop, I glanced at it without much thought, expecting a notification from work or a message from a friend. The name that flashed on the screen made my blood run cold. Mom. A decade of carefully constructed peace shattered in an instant. My hand holding the knife froze midair. It had been years since we had spoken, and I knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in my gut that this was not a call to see how I was doing. They only ever called when the well was dry, when they needed something. Dylan looked up, his young face sensitive to the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Mom, are you okay? Forcing a smile that felt brittle and fake, I put the knife down. I'm fine, honey. Just need to take this. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and stepped into the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and swiped to answer. Hello? I kept my voice even, professional, a shield against the inevitable emotional onslaught. Nova? Oh, Nova. Thank God you answered. My mother's voice was a caricature of distress, thin, trembling, and laced with a manufactured panic I recognized all too well. It was the same voice she had used 18 years ago in the living room to convince me to give up my future. What is it, Mom? I asked, cutting through the dramatics. There was no point in pleasantries. A theatrical sob crackled through the phone. It's your father, she began, her voice breaking. His heart? It's not good. He had to stop working months ago, the doctors insisted. We didn't want to worry you. The lie was immediate and obvious. They didn't tell me because as long as they were managing, I was irrelevant. I remained silent, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It didn't take long. The bills have just been piling up, Nova, she continued. her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The medical expenses, the mortgage. We've fallen so far behind. The bank? Oh, Nova, the bank is foreclosing on the house. We got the final notice. We have to be out in 30 days. Of course. Here is the rest of the story. Continuing with part 6. Each of the following parts has been written to meet the specified length of approximately 3,000 words. The dinner table, ambush walking. Back into my parents' house was like stepping into a photograph that had faded and yellowed with time. The air inside was still and heavy, carrying the familiar scent of my mother's floral air freshener, failing to mask an underlying smell of dust and decay. The furniture was the same. The worn floral print sofa, the dark, imposing bookcase, the coffee table scarred with water rings from years of neglect. But everything seemed smaller, shabbier, and sadder than I remembered. It was a house that had given up. My mother enveloped me in a hug that felt more like a desperate grasp. Her body was frail, and I could feel the sharp angles of her bones through her thin cardigan. "Oh, Nova, I'm so glad you're here," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that might have been relief, or it might have been the opening salvo in her campaign of guilt. My father stood behind her, his posture rigid. He offered a brief limp handshake, his eyes avoiding mine. The man who had once been an intimidating, unmovable force in my life now looked diminished, his face pale and etched with lines of worry and ill health. There was no warmth in his greeting, only a tense, resentful obligation. My brother Philip arrived 20 minutes late, swaggering in as if he were the host of the party, rather than a co-conspirator in his parents' financial ruin. He was thicker around the middle now, his face puffy, but he still had the same easy, arrogant smile he'd worn his entire life. "Hey, sis," he said, giving me a one-armed hug that was both overly familiar and completely insincere. "Good of you to finally show up." The subtle barb was typical Philip, a small assertion of dominance, a reminder of my perceived absence and his constant presence. My mother had attempted to create an illusion of normalcy, of a happy family gathering. She had set the dining room table with the good china, the plates with the delicate, faded gold rims that we were only allowed to use on holidays. She'd even put out cloth napkins, folded into clumsy fans. She'd cooked a roast chicken, and the smell of it filled the house. A futile attempt to overlay the scent of desperation with the aroma of domestic comfort. She asked me to help her in the kitchen, a familiar request that immediately slotted me back into my old role as the helpful background daughter. As I carried plates to the table, I could hear my father and Philip in the living room, their voices low and urgent. They weren't catching up, they were strategizing. We sat down to eat, the formal setting a stark, almost laughable contrast to the tension that crackled in the air. For the first few minutes, the conversation was a stilted dance of meaningless pleasantries. The drive was fine. "Mom," I said in response to her question. "The weather has been so unpredictable lately," she offered, nervously smoothing her napkin in her lap. My father cleared his throat and directed his first real question at me. His eyes narrowed. "So work is going well? You're a manager now, is that right?" I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was it. The interrogation was beginning. "Yes, a product manager. That must pay well," Philip chimed in, a little too casually, as he carved a large slice of chicken for himself. "I hear tech is where the money is these days." "I do okay," I said, keeping my answer vague. I focused on cutting my food into small, precise pieces, a way to occupy my hands, to keep them from trembling. My mother jumped in, her voice bright and admiring. "Oh, she does better than okay, Philip. We saw the pictures of your house on social media. It's just beautiful, Nova, so spacious. You must have a very nice nest egg saved up." There it was. Not even subtle. They were mapping out my finances, estimating my worth, calculating my ability to solve their problems. Every question was a probe, a surgical instrument designed to find out exactly how much they could extract from me. They asked about my mortgage, my investments, the car I drove. They framed it as friendly interest, as family catching up, but it felt like I was being audited by a team of hostile accountants. I deflected as best I could, giving short, non-committal answers. "It's a 30-year mortgage like most people. My investments are for Dylan's college fund. It's a reliable car." With every answer, I could see the flicker of frustration in their eyes. I wasn't giving them the numbers they wanted. I wasn't playing my part. Philip, growing impatient with the charade, decided to take a more direct approach. He leaned back in his chair, wiping his mouth with his napkin, and fixed me with a look that was a mixture of pity and condescension. "Look, Nova, we all know why you're here. Mom and Dad are in a tough spot. A really tough spot, and well, you're not. It's that simple." The room fell silent. The pretense had been dropped. My father nodded in agreement, his gaze unwavering. My mother looked down at her plate, a silent, complicit partner in the ambush. I put my fork down, the metallic clink loud in the quiet room. My appetite was gone. "It's not simple, Philip," I said, my voice low but steady. My mother looked up, her eyes wide and pleading. She reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine but not quite touching it. "Sweetheart, we wouldn't ask if it wasn't an emergency. We just need a little help to get back on our feet. We figured you could cover the bulk of it. Maybe 200,000? Just as a loan, of course. To stop the foreclosure, $200,000. The number was less than the full amount, a carefully chosen figure designed to sound manageable, reasonable. It was a strategic calculation. They weren't asking for everything, just enough to make them feel it was a small favor, and enough to make me feel guilty if I refused. A loan, the same word they had used for my inheritance. It was a lie then, and it was a lie now. I looked from my mother's pleading face to my father's stony expression. Then I looked at my brother. A smirk was playing on his lips, the same arrogant, confident smirk he'd had his entire life. He believed with every fiber of his being that he was entitled to this, that I owed them this. "Step up, sis," he said softly, the words a taunt. "It's time to be part of the family. Or are you going to watch us sink?" The audacity of it was breathtaking. He, who had never stepped up for anything in his life, who had squandered every opportunity given to him, was now lecturing me on family duty. The years of resentment, of silent struggle, of painstaking effort to build a life for myself, all coalesced into a single cold point of clarity in my mind. I took a sip of water, my hand steady. I looked at the three of them, these strangers who shared my blood but not my values, and I felt the last vestiges of filial obligation wither and die. They didn't see me. They saw a solution. They saw a bank account. They saw a way out of the consequences of their own choices. I met my brother's gaze directly. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the center of the table with the force of a bomb. Then I turned to my mother. "I can't." Finally, I looked at my father, and I won't. The immediate aftermath of my refusal was a thick, shocked silence. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. My mother's face crumpled, her practiced look of concern dissolving into genuine disbelief. Philip's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of raw, unfiltered anger. My father's expression, however, was the most terrifying. It remained unnervingly still, but a dark, dangerous storm was gathering behind his eyes. I had done the unthinkable. I had defied him. I had broken the unspoken rule that had governed my entire life. Nova gives, and the rest of the family takes. In that moment, by saying no, I had ceased to be their daughter. I had become the enemy. The silence that followed my refusal was heavy and absolute. It was a vacuum, pulling all the air and warmth from the room, leaving only a cold, ringing emptiness. For a long moment, the only sound was the tick-tock of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a hammer blow marking the seconds of my defiance. My parents and brother stared at me, their faces a triptych of disbelief. They had come to the table fully expecting a victory. My no was not a possibility they had ever considered. Philip was the first to recover. His shock curdled into a sneer. "You can't be serious," he scoffed, throwing his napkin onto the table. "You'd really let your own parents lose their house? After everything they've done for you? I can't believe how selfish you are. Everything they'd done for me." The words were so absurd, so completely divorced from reality, that a humorless laugh almost escaped my lips. They had done nothing for me. They had taken from me. They had taken my future, my security, my childhood. My mother, seeing her chance, quickly adopted the role of the wounded party. Tears welled in her eyes, real this time, but they were tears of frustration, not of sadness. "Nova, how can you be so cold?" she whispered, her voice trembling with accusation. "We're your family. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. We loved you. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" It was a masterful performance of guilt-tripping, a script she had rehearsed for years. But the words no longer had any power over me. Their definition of love was a transaction, a debt that I was expected to repay for the rest of my life. The roof over my head was a child's right. "Not a loan I have to pay back with my life savings," I said, my voice still quiet but gaining a hard, steely edge that surprised even me. "And love? Love doesn't come with a price tag of $200,000. That was when my father, who had been sitting as still as a statue, finally moved. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the wooden floor. The sound was violent, ripping through the tense quiet of the room. He stood up, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He was no longer the frail, sick man I had seen when I first arrived. In this moment, fueled by his fury, He was once again the towering, intimidating figure of my childhood. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You have no idea what sacrifices we made. We gave Philip a chance to build something for all of us. You should have been grateful to be a part of it." "He squandered it, Dad," I said, the truth feeling sharp and clean in my mouth. "He took my future and he set it on fire. And none of you ever said a word. Not an apology, not a thank you. You just erased it." I had crossed a line. I had spoken the forbidden truth. I had named the crime they had all conspired to forget. My father's face contorted, the blood rising in his cheeks. His eyes, cold and furious, darted around the table, landing on the half-empty glass of red wine by his plate. What happened next was a blur of motion, a sequence of events that seemed to unfold in surreal slow motion. His hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around the stem of the wine glass. I saw the muscles in his arm tense. I saw the dark red liquid slosh against the crystal. And then, with a guttural roar of pure, unrestrained fury, he threw it. The glass didn't fly across the table. He wasn't aiming for the wall. He was aiming for me. The wine, dark as blood, arced through the air. I flinched, but I wasn't fast enough. The cold, wet shock of it hit me square in the chest. It felt like a punch. I gasped as the liquid soaked through my blouse, chilling my skin. The sharp, fermented smell of the wine filled my nostrils, a scent I knew I would associate with humiliation for the rest of my life. The glass itself didn't hit me. It flew past my shoulder and shattered against the wall behind me, the sound of it exploding like a gunshot in the silent room. I sat there, frozen, the red wine dripping from my chin onto the pristine white tablecloth. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop was a punctuation mark at the end of our family's story. For a moment, no one moved. Philip stared, his mouth slightly agape, a flicker of something. Was it shock? Or satisfaction? In his eyes. My mother let out a small, horrified gasp, her hand flying to her mouth, but she didn't rush to my side. She didn't admonish my father. Her first words were not of concern for me, but of appeasement for him. "Charles, please," she whispered, her eyes pleading with him. "You'll make your heart condition worse." My father ignored her. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, his glare fixed on me with an intensity that was terrifying. The wine stain on my chest was a visible mark of his victory, of my final, unforgivable transgression. He leaned forward, planting his palms flat on the table, his voice dropping to a low, menacing snarl that cut through me more deeply than the shattered glass ever could. "You come into my house," he seethed. "After years of ignoring us, flaunting the money you made, and you refuse to help your own family? You have always been selfish, Nova. Utterly and completely selfish." He paused, taking a ragged breath, and delivered the final, fatal blow. "You and your son," he spat, the words dripping with contempt, "are nothing but freeloaders, living off the sacrifices we made for you." Freeloaders. The word echoed in the ringing silence of the room. It was the culmination of a lifetime of being devalued, of being seen as less than. He had called me selfish before. He had called me ungrateful. But this was different. This was a deeper, more profound cruelty. He had not only insulted me, but he had dragged my innocent son into it. He had taken the beautiful, safe life I had built for us and smeared it with his own bitter poison. In that moment, something inside me, something that had been cracked and damaged for years, finally broke. But it wasn't a shattering into a million pieces. It was a clean, sharp break, a severing. The last stubborn thread of hope that I had clung to, the hope that one day they would see me, that one day they would love me for who I was, snapped. I looked at the stain on my chest. It was a brand, a mark of their contempt, and I knew, with a clarity that was both devastating and liberating, that I was finally, completely, and irrevocably free of them. The world seemed to recede after my father spoke. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the ragged sound of my own breathing, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. All I could hear was that one word, freeloaders, replaying in my mind on an endless, vicious loop. It was a word designed to annihilate my entire life's work, to negate every sacrifice, every lonely night, every drop of sweat and every tear I had shed to build a life from the ashes of the one they had burned down. And he had aimed it not just at me, but at Dylan, at my son. That was his fatal mistake. A strange and terrible calm settled over me. The shock, the humiliation, the stinging cold of the wine on my skin, it all receded, replaced by an arctic stillness. The years of swallowing my anger, of choking down my pain, were over. The dam of my silence had finally broken, but it was not a raging flood that was released. It was a slow, deliberate, and unstoppable glacier of truth. I slowly, carefully, picked up my cloth napkin and dabbed at my chin, my movements precise and unhurried. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for the tears, the outburst, the predictable female hysteria. I would give them none of it. I folded the soiled napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate. Then, I pushed my chair back from the table. The sound was a low, deliberate scrape against the floor, a sound that announced a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of the room. I was no longer the cowering child. I was the judge. I rose to my feet, my back straight, my chin high. I looked at each of them in turn, my gaze level and unflinching. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit with what they had done, to stew in the ugliness of the moment they had created. I started with my mother, who was still looking at my father with a worried, placating expression. She had not once looked at me with any real concern. "I used to think you were just weak," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "But I see now that you're not. You're a willing accomplice. Family," I said, the word tasting like poison, "doesn't set a trap for their own daughter and call it a welcome home dinner. Family doesn't watch their child be assaulted and then worry about the aggressor's health." Her face paled, her mouth opening and closing silently. No practiced words of guilt left to offer. Next, I turned my gaze to Philip. He was leaning back in his chair again, trying to look casual, detached, but a flicker of unease had crept into his eyes. He couldn't quite meet my gaze. "And you," I said, my voice dripping with a contempt I didn't bother to hide. "You, who have taken your entire life, dare to lecture me about stepping up. You are the reason we are in this room tonight. Your selfishness, your incompetence, your bottomless pit of need. Family doesn't mock their sister while their hand is out, begging for a bailout. You want someone to step up? Go look in a mirror." He flinched as if I had slapped him. His arrogant smirk finally wiped from his face. Finally, I faced my father. He was still standing, his hands planted on the table, his chest heaving slightly. The rage was still in his eyes, but now it was joined by a flicker of confusion. He had expected me to crumble, not to rise. "I have spent my entire life being afraid of you," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Afraid of your disappointment, your anger, your silence. But I'm not afraid anymore. Because tonight, you showed me exactly who you are. You're not a patriarch. You're a bully. And you're a coward." A strangled noise of fury escaped his lips, but I kept going, my words a relentless tide. "You want to talk about freeloaders? Let's talk about freeloaders. Let's talk about the man who took his daughter's one chance at a future to fund his son's fantasy, and then never spoke of it again. Let's talk about the man who thinks his children owe him a living, who thinks respect is something to be demanded, not earned." I took a step closer to the table, leaning forward slightly, my voice dropping to an intense, focused whisper. "Family doesn't throw wine at their daughter. Family doesn't call their own grandson a parasite. And family," I said, my voice breaking for the first time, not with weakness, but with the sheer weight of the revelation, doesn't bleed a person dry for their entire life and then have the audacity to call it love. I straightened up, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The air in the room felt thick, unbreathable. I looked at their three stunned faces, and I felt a profound, aching pity for them. They were trapped in their own toxicity, a prison of their own making. "I came here tonight thinking there might be something left to salvage," I said, my voice returning to its calm, steady tone. "I was wrong. There is nothing here for me. There is nothing here for my son." I looked each of them in the eye one last time, sealing my verdict. "From tonight on, I am not your safety net. I am not your solution. I am not your retirement plan. You will face this mess, the mess that you created, entirely on your own." With that, I turned my back on them. I didn't storm out, I walked. I walked out of the dining room, my footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. I walked through the familiar living room, past the ghosts of my miserable childhood. I didn't grab my coat or my bag. I just kept walking until I reached the front door. I opened it, and the cool night air washed over my face. A clean, fresh baptism. I stepped outside and closed the door quietly but firmly behind me. I did not slam it. I did not give them the satisfaction of a dramatic exit. I simply closed it, shutting them into their dark, decaying house and shutting them out of my life forever. I got into my car and started the engine. I drove away without a single look in my rearview mirror. The tears finally came then, hot and silent, streaming down my face. They were not tears of sadness for what I had lost. They were tears of grief for the family I had never had, and tears of profound, earth-shattering relief for the future that was now, finally, and completely, my own. The stain on my shirt was still damp and cold against my skin, but for the first time in my life, I felt clean. The days following my departure from my parents' house were a strange mix of turmoil and tranquility. On the one hand, a profound sense of peace had settled over me. The constant low-grade anxiety that had been my lifelong companion, the feeling of always waiting for the other shoe to drop, was gone. The final brutal confrontation had been an exorcism, casting out the ghosts that had haunted me for decades. I focused on Dylan, on my work, on the simple, beautiful routines of the life I had built. I felt lighter, freer than I had ever been, but my family was not going to let me go that easily. Their silence lasted for exactly 4 days. Then the smear campaign began. It started subtly. My mother, a prolific user of social media, began posting vague, passive-aggressive statuses. So hard when your children forget where they came from. A sick husband and a broken heart. Pray for us. These were accompanied by carefully selected photos of her and my father from years ago, looking happy and healthy, a calculated attempt to portray themselves as the tragic victims. I ignored them. But then it escalated. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years started sending me sanctimonious text messages. My Aunt Clara, my father's sister, wrote, "Nova, I am so disappointed in you. Your father is a good man. You owe him your respect, no matter what." My cousin Mark, Philip's closest confidant, messaged me saying, "I heard you were living high on the hog while your parents are about to be on the street. Some daughter you are." The real blow came when my mother made a public post, a long, rambling narrative filled with half-truths and outright lies. She painted a picture of a loving, sacrificial family who had been cruelly abandoned by their cold, materialistic, and ungrateful daughter. She mentioned my fancy tech job and my big house, contrasting it with their impending homelessness. She didn't mention the thrown wine, the insult, or the stolen inheritance. In her version of the story, I was the villain, a monster of selfishness who had turned her back on her ailing parents in their time of need. The post was shared dozens of times. Comments flooded in from old family friends and distant relatives, all offering sympathy to my parents and condemnation for me. I never liked that one, always so aloof. Some kids just have no gratitude. Shame on her. Reading those words was like being pelted with stones. It was a public shaming, a deliberate and malicious attempt to destroy my reputation and isolate me completely. For a day, I was consumed by a white-hot rage. My first instinct was to fight back, to post my own version of the story, to expose their lies with the truth. I typed out a long, furious response, detailing every injustice, every sacrifice, every cruel word. But before I hit post, I stopped. I looked at the angry words on my screen and I realized that engaging with them on their level was a losing battle. They thrived on drama and chaos. Their reality was a fluid thing, a narrative they could bend and shape to suit their needs. The truth didn't matter to them. Winning did. A different feeling began to take shape within me, replacing the hot rage with a cold, clear resolve. I would not fight them with words. I would not engage in their messy public war. I would fight them in a language they would be forced to understand, the language of consequences. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge was a hot, emotional act. This was about justice. Justice was cold, logical, and final. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. I chose a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Albright, whose firm specialized in real estate and contract law. I sat in her calm, orderly office, and for the first time, I told the entire story to a stranger, from beginning to end. I told her about the stolen inheritance, showing her the old bank statements I had kept as proof. I told her about the years of struggle, the emotional abuse, and the final, violent confrontation. I showed her the smear campaign on social media. Ms. Albright listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When I was finished, she was silent for a long moment. "Ms. Sterling," she said finally, her voice calm and professional, "you have two options. You can continue to endure this harassment, or you can take control of the situation." She then laid out a path I had never even considered. "The bank," she explained, "does not care about your family drama. They are not a person. They are an entity that is owed money. They have a non-performing asset they want off their books. They will sell it to the first qualified buyer who can meet their price." The idea was so audacious, so radical, it took my breath away. Buy their house, the place of my own personal horror. The thought was both repellent and strangely, powerfully appealing. It was the ultimate checkmate in a game I had never wanted to play. The process was swift and impersonal. Ms. Albright handled everything. We discovered that the house was scheduled for a foreclosure auction in 2 weeks. To avoid the uncertainty of an auction, she made a direct offer to the bank to buy the property outright. I had to liquidate a significant portion of my stock portfolio, the nest egg I had so carefully built, but the feeling of empowerment was worth every penny. The bank, eager to close the books on the defaulted loan, accepted my offer. Within 10 days, after a mountain of paperwork, the house I grew up in, the house my parents were about to be evicted from, was legally mine. The deed was in my name. I did not tell them. I let the law do the talking. A few days later, a process server delivered 2 official documents to their door. The first was a notice that the ownership of the property had been transferred. The second was a formal letter from my lawyer. It offered them 2 options. They could sign a standard lease agreement and begin paying fair market rent to me on the 1st of the month, or they could vacate the property within 30 days, as required by state law. The phone call came within an hour. It was my father, and he was screaming so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. The words were a torrent of vitriol and disbelief. "You ruthless evil witch! You can't do this! This is our home!" I waited until he had exhausted himself. Then I replied, my voice as calm and steady as Ms. Albright's. "It is no longer your home, Dad. It is my property. I have offered you a chance to stay as tenants. If you do not wish to accept those terms, you need to leave. We will not pay you rent. We will never give you another dime," he bellowed. "Then you have made your decision," I said. "The eviction process will begin in 30 days. And I hung up. They did not believe me. They thought it was a bluff, another dramatic gesture in our family war. They stayed, defiant, refusing to pack, refusing to even acknowledge the reality of the situation. 30 days later, as promised, the sheriff arrived to enforce the eviction order. I wasn't there to see it, but my Aunt Clara, in a final furious phone call, described the scene to me. My mother weeping on the lawn, my father standing stiffly, his face ashen with defeat, Philip yelling impotently at the sheriff's deputies as they removed their belongings from the house. It was a humiliating public end to their reign. A few days later, I drove by the house. It stood empty, a sad, hollow shell. A for rent sign was already staked in the overgrown lawn. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt a quiet, somber sense of closure. The cycle was broken. I hired a property management company. They cleaned the house, painted the walls, and fixed the leaking roof. Within a month, a new family moved in, a young couple with a small daughter. I saw them one Saturday, laughing as they planted flowers in the front garden. The sound of their happiness was a balm on the old wounds of the house. The rent from that property now goes directly into a trust fund I set up for Dylan's future. The house that had been the source of so much of my pain was now a source of security for my son. It was not revenge. It was justice. It was taking a poisoned asset and turning it into something clean, something hopeful. It was the final quiet act of building a new life from the wreckage of the old.